It is hard not to be angry at white people, at injustice, at stories not told, not heard, the stories we don't get to hear. It is hard not to become my anger, to see everything in red, black bodies in pools of red, black bodies lynched, black bodies hanging from the ties we lost to our motherland, lost in this country that we were forced to call home, constantly made to feel other and less than in a place that we built as slaves, whipped as slaves, branded as slaves. And after all these years, we're still not free, trapped behind these bars of modern day slavery.
About 10 minutes ago, the Minnesota Board of Pardons voted to free a man convicted of killing an 11-year-old girl back in 2002. Mayan Burrell was convicted in 2003, then again in 2008 in the murder of Taisha Edwards. The 11-year-old was killed by a stray bullet as she sat in her house doing her homework.
Mayan Burrell, Mayan DeMarlo Burrell. My father moved to Minnesota from Omaha, Nebraska in the late 70s. My mom's family, her whole family's from here, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, North Minneapolis.
It's 5 of us. Our older brother, Larry, then we have Michael, and then it's me, Mayan, and Martrez. So we all were raised in the same household until in 2002 is when Mayan was incarcerated falsely, accused for a crime he didn't commit. And when he was fighting for his life, our mother died within a couple weeks of him being
incarcerated,
being arrested.
My entire youth was spent in the justice system, in the criminal justice system. That day, when I went up to Portland Foods, and I sensed something off, like it was just something didn't feel right. I remember just looking outside and seeing like unmarked squad cars. I haven't done anything wrong, so I didn't have any fear.
Now, Burrell was just 16 at the time of the murder of Taisha Edwards. Burrell, shown here, always maintained his innocence.
Long story short, I ended up getting kidnapped. And that was the last place I seen a free world for nearly 2 decades. I remember being forced into the back of a police car and being pulled around to the other side of the block on 5th, being taken out of the unmarked squad car, put into a police squad car, and hauled into Hennepin County Jail as a 16-year-old child. I remember the devastation and just feeling like lost.
It was shocking. It just wasn't fair. And even to this day, we still don't understand how, why.
There were always questions about whether he should have been identified as a third person. We know that there were objective witnesses who identified someone who looked nothing like Mayan as the shooter, people working on adjacent roofs. We know that both co-defendants have now said Mayan didn't do it. One has admitted he was the shooter. We know that in his second trial, that the prosecution, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, relied on 5 to 6 jailhouse informants whose testimony was provided in exchange for deals on their own cases. We know that there is no direct forensic evidence tying Mayan to the gun or to the scene. There are no ballistics that prove that Mayan shot her. I don't know why things went down as they did, but I do know that there are a lot of holes that a lot of people have pointed out through the years, and that an independent panel has said raises a lot of critical questions about his conviction.
It showed that he wasn't innocent till proven guilty. He was guilty until proven innocent, like most definitely.
That system was designed to dehumanize people and to turn them into something other than a human being. Look at the facts in my case. Look at all the police misconduct. Look at all the lies. Look at all the falsifying evidence. Look at all of these things, and then go back and research and see if even one of these people were held accountable for the injustice that they imposed on me.
There's no aspect about taking a 16-year-old and sticking him in a cage for 18 years that isn't inherently dehumanizing.
Police officers started out as slave patrols, trying to catch so-called fugitive slaves.
Slave patrols in the 1800s were organized, authorized white men who were allowed to track down and make arrests of slaves.
It started out as the cavalry. And so the cavalry would come in, and they were there to round up indigenous folks. They were there to round up runaway slaves, and they were deputized to go after essentially people of color that had no business living lives like white folks.
And now the 13th Amendment was supposed to abolish slavery. But if you read the language of the 13th Amendment, it essentially says, I'm paraphrasing, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall be allowed, except if one has been duly convicted of a crime. And so the 13th Amendment actually empowered these men to come into communities of newly freed enslaved persons and use the law to their advantage to round up primarily Black men and to bring them into the justice system.
There are still traces of that today. Of course, we have a different system, but law enforcement today is still predominantly white, and they still operate predominantly in communities of color, and they still can stop and search and sometimes arrest people for very little suspicion of criminal behavior.
To know that the origin of police in the US is runaway slave catchers and slave patrolmen, that shows you what they were about from the get. And the question that I would submit to the people watching this is, if the cake is cooked with, if the cake is baked with, rotten materials, can you ever make a good cake? So if those materials from the ground up are all ready to predate, publicly execute, and criminalize Black folks, what do you think you're gonna get?
If I had to give a synopsis of the school to prison pipeline, I would say that it has become a system that allows the almost seamless integration of police officers from the streets and into schools. Now, the justification for bringing police in schools started with the mass school shooting that happened in Colorado, where two young white boys went in, shot up a school, killed many people, and suddenly there was this push to bring officers in schools to protect children from mass shooters coming into the community. The schools in our communities are being overwhelmed by the presence of not only police officers, but the fact that police officers have become the de facto disciplinarian in those environments.
I see it play out in things like kids getting arrested for disorderly conduct instead of just having a sit down with the principal. I see it in the increase in police officers actually present in schools as opposed to school officials handling disciplinary matters.
These zero tolerance policies came into play, and it wasn't necessarily about the policy, but how people enacted those policies, right? So again, when we have this anti-Black belief, it plays out in how we apply those policies to situations.
Nowadays, if a child gets into a fight, they could be led out of the school in handcuffs and charged with assault and battery.
Black children are in prison from the moment they walk into the educational system. In order for anybody to learn, their conditions, their environment have to be conducive to that. What our children get is educational trauma. If I put all these stereotypes on Black children that they cannot read, that they aren't good students, that they don't succeed, when they go into the classroom, there's all this pressure to prove them wrong. So there's no safe space to even make mistakes. And then when they make mistakes, they don't have teachers there to receive those mistakes and use them as feedback and in the lessons to push them further. They use it as a form of humiliation and a way to label them. So then when you then label them, what happens? It's an excuse to discriminate against them. They become special ed, they become EBD, they become all these labels that then say we have the right then to segregate you, to say you are incapable of this. And so they go throughout their whole educational career not believing in themselves.
It's always assumptions, like we're up to no good, stereotypes, false narratives. Society adultifies us. It's not the same treatment that white kids receive. Like Black and brown kids aren't allowed to have a bad day. We're not allowed to get poor grades without being called idiots.
This educational system takes away our Black children's self-esteem, sense of self, self-determination, and replaces it with dependency, right, with miseducation, with punishment, all the things that says that you deserve to be locked up. You don't deserve goodness in this life.
Most of these officers don't have specific training in working with young people, nor do they have cultural competency much of the time. So why are they being placed in a sensitive environment where children are trying to grow emotionally, psychologically, as well as get their education?
If you ever had something stolen from you, then you can relate to the experience that I went through. I had to watch everything that I knew, everything that I understood about life actually disappear in front of my face and be powerless to hold on to it. When I was coming up, it wasn't abnormal for police officers to just roll up and rough you up for no reason. Just because you were together, you and your friends was walking. That was my first interaction with police officers, was them coming up and victimizing me as a youth. Like, it wasn't even looked at as being something that was outside of the norm. It was just to stay away from the police because that's what they do. Nobody took the time out to even ask, like, what happened? Like, how did this little boy end up in prison? Like, how did he end up in the county jail? Is this evidence adding up? Nobody took it, but it was just like, no, he's been demonized, he's been criminalized, he's no longer a human being. And this is laying the foundation to justify the mass incarceration of these youth that are out here in the community. They're not looking at the source of the problem. They created the conditions that made them want to go out there to a completely different community and do the things that they're doing. And if you never address the problem at the source, the history is going to continuously repeat itself.
Our children aren't looked at as children. Even if they're a teenager, even if they're 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, our children is looked at as threats.
It took the murder of George Floyd, which happened on May 25th of 2020, for the Minneapolis public school system to finally decide to remove police officers from schools. But why should it have taken watching a public lynching of a Black man in order for Minneapolis public schools officials to know that they had a problem? There is a greater need for intervention, holistic intervention, making sure that kids know how to problem solve and engage in conflict resolution, and that they have productive things to do in their communities. That hasn't been the focus. We would rather spend money to send police officers in schools, not to stop mass shootings, but to hone in on minor infractions by children and to criminalize them as a result.